Welcome to Inco Terms 101, Impacts and Considerations. So, what are Inco terms? Let's take a look. Inco terms is actually short for International Commercial Terms or International Commercial Terms of Sale. Inco terms spells out where, which is usually a place, and when, which, believe it or not, is usually an action, risk of loss passes from the seller to the buyer. We're going to talk more about risk of loss in a minute. Inco terms also spell out who pays for and or who controls each phase of the international movement or shipping of the goods. If you think about it, somebody has to pay to load the truck. Somebody has to pay to move the truck to the port or to the airport. Somebody has to pay to load it again onto the plane or onto the ship. Somebody has to pay for an outbound customs release. Somebody has to pay for freight charges. Somebody's got to pay for customs clearance at the destination. So what we end up noticing here is that those movements and shipping of the goods constitutes a substantial increase in the total cost of the product that's being purchased. So Inco terms spells out who pays for each of those different pieces. Inco terms and the law. Inco terms are managed by the International Chamber of Commerce. They're not laws. They're not even required. And realistically, they will not eliminate all lawsuits and miscommunications and problems that you can have with your various partners, be they suppliers or vendors or customers. Inco terms can be, and often are, superseded by the terms of contracts, purchase orders, sales orders, and other legally binding documents. So you need to take care and make sure that whenever possible, the Inco terms mimic the other legally binding contractual documents. You need to make sure that if what your contract says is it's delivered and is duty paid and brought right to the customer's door, that your Inco terms are DDP and not FCA. It's important that you make sure these things match. Otherwise, you're going to have problems down the road with insurance carriers and other problems that can crop up. Why are Inco terms used? Good question. Communication is difficult, even under the best of circumstances. We've all had instances where, for one reason or another, our communication went bad. Even when we're dealing with our own language. Now, when you use different languages, things become even more complex. If I speak English and you speak Japanese, that adds to communication confusion. Regional dialects, especially in countries like China, where you could speak impeccable Mandarin and end up speaking to someone who understands Cantonese, and you end up with some difficulties there. And then industry jargon. Just the words we use. If I tell you that I'll pay for cartage, and you're expecting trucking or drayage, or one of us is treating all three of those words as meaning the same thing, when in reality, go ahead and look them up. You'll see each one is slightly different. Cartage, drayage, and trucking. Three different things. That adds to confusion. Local customs. If I tell you that I'm going to get it ready for you for export, and you anticipate that that means I'm also going to do the export clearance, you may be wrong. It depends on what country we're in, what region we're in, okay? So that adds to confusion. So in short, the reason we use Inco terms is to make sure we're all using the same lingo. Notice I said lingo, not language. We all can use different languages, but if we can all agree on the meanings and definitions of the words and abbreviations used in the Inco terms, created by the International Chamber of Commerce for this particular reason, if we can agree to use the Inco terms, therefore we're agreeing to the same definitions, therefore we drive a lot of the confusion that's present in normal conversation out of the equation. That's why we use Inco terms. Risk of loss versus title. I said we were going to speak about this in depth. So risk of loss. The party who has risk of loss is the party who has to replace the material if the shipment is lost or damaged. So if the ship goes down, heaven forbid, but if the ship goes down, who has to pay to replace those goods? For example, if the seller has the risk of loss, the seller is out all the money that just sank to the bottom of the sea unless he has insurance, in which case the insurance company will reimburse him for the cost of manufacture of the goods. Now, he remanufactures the goods, sends another shipment, and hopefully this one gets through. On the other hand, if the buyer has risk of loss and the vessel goes down, the shipment gets lost, okay, something bad happens. Now the buyer still has to pay the seller for those goods, and in a perfect world is going to place a new purchase order on the seller for another order to replace the goods that were lost. The insurance company is going to reimburse the buyer for the cost that he or she has to pay for the goods. Now, insurance is never guaranteed. Insurance companies, they have a desire to not pay claims because that way they keep money. Okay? So the party that is designated by the Inco Terms as having risk of loss is the one that the insurance company will be most willing to reimburse. If the Inco Terms show delivered duty paid and the seller tries to make a claim, they'll probably be paid. But if the buyer tries to make a claim, they'll probably be denied. The insurance company will say, no, the terms are DDP. That means it's the seller's problem that those goods are at the bottom of the bay, and therefore they'll deny the claim. And you'll end up having to prove through some other documentation that you have the risk of loss. Title is completely different. Title is ownership. Title is ownership. That's the party that owns the goods. Title and ownership are not interchangeable. They don't mean the same thing. Title, I should say, and risk of loss are not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. I can have title. I can own goods. I can lend them to you through a lease or a rental or some other mechanism. And in a contract, I can say that you are responsible if what I am lending to you gets damaged or destroyed. I have title. You have risk of loss. You should get some insurance, right? So we have to be very careful that we don't use these two interchangeably. And we have to make sure that the people in our firms and our companies, the people we do business with, don't use these terms interchangeably, because that's only going to add to the confusion. We need to make sure that we keep separate title and risk of loss, because the insurance carriers focus on risk of loss, not necessarily title. So, the importance of named places. Many of the Inco terms allow for the naming of a place. This is an important piece of information, and it's often overlooked. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's an FCA term or a delivered term. Most of them allow for the naming of a place. Now, FCA shipping point is something that you'll see quite a bit. Let's say you're purchasing from me, and you want the goods delivered to Mexico City, and you think I'm shipping it from my office in Frederick, Maryland. So we agree to FCA shipping point. Well, it turns out I actually manufacture these goods in Taiwan. So what you've actually agreed to is to pay for the international shipping from Taiwan to Mexico City, and not a truck move from Frederick, Maryland to Mexico City. You see how that confusion can happen? What about FCA port? This is another one. I've seen this one a lot. FCA port. We'll scribble around that one a little bit. FCA port. What port? So again, now you think you're purchasing it, and you think I'm going to get it to some port, an airport, an ocean port, right? Well, again, if I'm manufacturing it, go back to Taiwan. I'm manufacturing it in Taiwan. I'm going to get it to the port in Taiwan. And all of a sudden, you're still responsible to get it all the way down to Mexico City. Let's take another example, okay, where I'm selling to you, right? And your destination where you want the stuff delivered to is in Rome, Italy. And we sit down and you say, I want the stuff FCA, and I say, well, FCA where? And it comes out that my plant is in Germany, and we agree to FCA Hamburg port, and from Hamburg you'll be responsible to get it to Rome. Do you see how this is much clearer? FCA Hamburg rather than FCA port or FCA shipping point or just FCA. So named places are important, and not just with FCA. You could have the same thing happen with a CPT shipment, carriage paid to. Well, under CPT, I'm responsible as the seller to pay the shipping charges to get it to the named place. Now, normally with CPT, the named place is usually a port, right? So FCA Shanghai, I would be responsible to get it to the airport or to the port in Shanghai, right? You need to specify these things, because otherwise, you could say CPT China, and I'm only going to get it as far as the local port in Shenzhen, and now you've got to do an inland move all the way up to Shanghai, and it causes more problems because maybe you don't have a customs broker in Shenzhen. Right? So it doesn't matter what term you're using. If it accepts a named place, make sure you get a named place that makes sense for you and your business. Having the wrong or no named place, it increases risk, because now is your insurance going to cover it? Right? Ambiguity. You and I are going to have all sorts of arguments about this because I thought you meant one thing and you thought you meant another. And more importantly, it can wreak havoc with your insurance carrier. If you end up transporting something from an area that has a war risk, and you don't have a war risk clause on your insurance, and the goods get destroyed, now if you own the risk of loss, now you're out the money, right? So you really want to make sure that you get your named place correct, documented, agreed to. Make sure you know all the details. Where is it going to ship from? Where is it going to ship to? It doesn't matter which side of the equation you're on. You need to know the details. So don't fall down on the job on this one. Make sure you're asking the right questions about the importance of the named place. Inco terms and revenue, or revenue recognition. This is an important topic, especially if you're a logistics person in your firm, or if you're a finance person who's tasked with recognizing revenue. Okay? Satisfaction of the Inco term is only one part, one little tiny piece of revenue recognition. Okay? The fact that you got it as far as you needed to recognize the Inco term doesn't mean you get to recognize the revenue. Remember, risk of loss and title are not interchangeable. I told you to pay attention to that piece, right? So in cases where title doesn't pass to the buyer, you can't recognize revenue. Title has to pass first. If you're selling it, not leasing it, but if you're selling something to a customer, they have to accept title before you can book that revenue on your books, in your financial accounts, right? There's a lot of reasons why title might not have passed. So even if it's a delivered duty paid term, which is the one that goes as far out as possible for the seller, the one that's as difficult as possible for the seller, right? Even in those cases where I know it's been delivered and duty paid, I've got a copy of a proof of delivery and everything else, that doesn't mean it's ready to be recognized for revenue. Other contractual terms, whether it's purchase order terms, contract terms, sales order terms, can impact whether or not you can recognize revenue. We'll start with title. Sometimes there's a 30-day clause. 30 days after delivery, we accept title. Some companies do that because they want to be able to inspect the goods, right? Other companies say that there has to be a letter of acceptance. So they're going to receive the goods. They're going to inspect it, and they're going to issue this letter of acceptance. And title passes when they give you that letter of acceptance. But you're not going to know that. You're the logistics person. You may not know that. If you're the finance person, you're only going to find those details out in the contract, right? So your logistics guy can't be the guy that tells you whether or not you can recognize revenue. All these other different things come into play. Um, I always say that you have to defer to your finance team, which probably has some revenue recognition group or revenue recognition person, because they've got greater visibility. Now, one of the things I was able to do was I have been able to generate reports that go forward through the quarter, and as shipments are retired against the Inco term. So it's met its Inco term requirement. So we call it retired. Any shipments that are retired, there's a report. So the finance team can go in and look at those shipments and see if those shipments are also okay for revenue. This way the finance team doesn't have to look at shipments that are lost in transit or got damaged or destroyed or anything else. They only have to look at the ones that made the cut as far as Inco terms. Right? And you can generate one of those reports as well. What you'd have to do is you have to generate a report that shows when each order made it to the point required in the Inco terms. You pass that report along to the finance team, and that's when they start looking to see whether or not the rest of the revenue recognition rules have been fulfilled. Make sense? I want to talk really quickly about Inco terms details. Now, this is a 101 course, okay? In the 101 course, you learn what the Inco terms are, okay? Why they're there. We're not going to go too deep into exactly what each one covers. Okay, so if you need the additional detail, you're going to need to take Inco Terms 201, which is actually going to have a detailed discussion around each Inco term. What it means, what it covers, when risk of loss passes, what parts of the supply chain costs are allocated to each of the seller and the buyer. But we're not going to go into each one of those here. Terms can be broken down as follows. Now, the current version of the Inco terms specifies that there are water transport terms. They only apply to water, including inland water, which would be barge and river traffic, right? And this includes FOB. So if you're still using FOB for truck movements, for air movements, for rail movements, stop. You're just adding to the confusion and the noise. Water transport only, okay? So FAS, which is freight alongside, FOB, right, which is free on board. You got a couple of other ones in the C terms, CFR, which is cost and freight, CIF, which is the cost of the goods, the insurance and the freight. These are all water terms. The rest of them are all general terms. They apply to air, road, sea. Yes, you can use the general ones for ocean and sea freight, but you can't use the waterway ones for anything other than waterway, okay? Also, they include rail and multimodal. So general terms are air, road, sea, rail, and multimodal. Okay, and you've got Ex Works, you've got free carrier, you've got CPT, which is carriage paid to, CIP, which is carriage and insurance paid to. Now you notice each one of these ones I'm talking about right now, they all have a named place. When you look at the actual Inco terms, you'll see that, right? There are a bunch of D terms, which have some kind of a delivered at place, okay? So whether it's delivered at terminal or delivered at place or DDP, which is delivered duty paid, the terms can be further split up. The E terms are Ex Works. I sold it to you. You come to my place of business. You pick it up, you load your own truck, you take it away. F terms normally have something to do with when the goods are handed off to a carrier, right? So if I'm handing it over to your truck at my facility, that's one named place, right? That would be, FCA, Jerry's plant, right? Or I could be doing an F term that's at the port. So it'd be, FCA Seattle port, okay? There's some C terms. Basically, C terms happen when risk of loss passes to the buyer as soon as the goods are handed off to a carrier, but the seller has to pay for some additional costs further upstream. Normally, that would be freight or that would be insurance, right? So even though the seller doesn't have risk of loss, the seller may be required to pay for insurance. And then D terms, as I said a minute ago, those normally involve some kind of delivery. It could be delivered at a terminal. It could be delivered at a particular place, which would be a named place. It could be delivered duty paid, where the actual duties and customs fees would all have to be included and paid for, right? But in order to understand all of those, you need to take the next level class. If you're one of the people who needs to do that, you need to sign up for the next level class, and we'll make sure that we get all those details to you. So we're going to go into a little bit of Q&A. First, I'm going to take questions, make sure that I answer them, as many of them as I can. Any questions that I can't answer for you right now, any more complex things come up, we're going to stick it in the parking lot. Everyone will get a copy of the parking lot, as well as copies of answers to each of the parking lot questions when those answers are available. And then we're going to go into a little bit more about additional resources where you can go to get some additional details within your own firm to help you deal with Inco terms. All right. I really appreciate everybody listening up till this point. For those of you that are watching this as a recording, I'm going to sign off now. But please make sure that you do feel free to reach out, ask questions, and I will do my best to get back to you as well. Thanks, and have a great day.